is a developer from San Francisco. Some random facts. He's got, if you're interested in public speaking, I know it's old, but he has I mean, it isn't, it's still...
It's not, it's matured.
It's current. It's still current. He has a website called speaking.io, which I've used in preparing for talks. Not emceeing, clearly. He was one of the...
You're doing good enough.
Thank you. Good enough. Thank you. I take that. I'll take that. He was one of the first engineering hires at GitHub, and he's currently the founder of a new startup called Bruning, which is all about calendars and dates. And he's here to speak about dates some more, something that we all grapple with on a daily basis. Well, lots of us do. I know I do. So thank you for coming all the way. And go for it.
Thank you. So, it is time to talk about time. If you didn't like that joke, you're in for a long, terrible talk. This talk should be called like crappy jokes and puns about time, so strap yourself in. Yeah, every time I've talked to somebody this week and they'd be like, oh, what are you speaking on? And I'd say like, oh, programming time. Usually, I think every single person just went, oh. One person added, ugh. And I was like, yeah, well, you know, we kind of inherently kind of know this, that time is really hard to work with. You can kind of, you know, you spend your first week in programming and you're like, oh, well, I really have to figure this stuff out. Yeah, this would be terrible, yeah. Time is hard. Time is like really, really hard. And it's not just a language thing. It's not like a, you know, Ruby gem install cool stuff and it fixes all your problems, and JavaScript won't fix your problems because if you start writing in JavaScript, then you have like 2 problems, and it's just like terrifying all over. I can't make that joke other conferences, so I'm among friends here, which is nice. But like we all have to deal with this sort of stuff because we're all gonna have to deal with timestamps and date stamps and all this sort of stuff at some point or another. You can't hide from it. This should really terrify you. Just use UTC is what people say all the time. Spoiler alert, not wrong. So I'm not going to say that like UTC is not going to work out for you. It's fine. But like that is like the normal advice across every blog post and hot take and Stack Overflow and you know, whatever the case is. There's just a lot of things. Like, got that one. A lot of things where it's just like, oh, if you just use UTC, everything will be totally fine. And like, yeah, it's going to help you out, but there's a lot more complicated things. Like the sky's the limit when it comes to time and programming. So that's what I want to talk about today. I'm Zach Holman on social things. This is a picture of me and my cat, but it's actually a metaphor where I represent programming time, and my cat represents how terrified you are of doing that. I love that. I actually got Stripe paid a photographer to take this photo, which just kills me every time. It's hilarious. So, once upon a time, I worked at GitHub for a long time, and it was like the running joke between me and one of my coworkers. He was just like, Zach, just never do a calendar, scheduling, like all of that stuff. Just it's terrible to build. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not that much of an idiot. Like, I'm never going to do that. Related, I'm building a calendar startup. It's a calendar. I'm not very good at following directions. Calendar's really interesting. I've been kind of working on this for like the last year or so, and obviously with a calendar, you're kind of running into all of the edge cases you can possibly do when you come into programming at the time. So I've been thinking a lot about this for a long time. I've actually started a list of things that I wanted to talk about since like a year. So there's a lot of weird things I want to talk about. So that's where it kind of stems from. Like even though like I'm building the crazy extreme side of things, like I think everybody runs into these weird problems more often than we want to believe and realize. So 3 main things I want to talk about today. Number 1, what is time? Get really philosophical and stuff. Secondly, like why time? Why is this so hard? You know. And finally, the main meat of everything is how do we use our code to tame this terrible thing of time? So philosophical. What is time? Well, that's a question as old as time. I do these jokes for me, not for you. Turns out, it's a valid question to ask, does time actually exist? Because like there's a bunch of scientists somewhere, wherever they keep scientists, and like if you stare at this and like the quantum level, like maybe time doesn't make sense, and like it slows down, and then maybe like none of this stuff exists, and I don't have the time to get into this, but we don't have to care about this. Like we exist, I think that's good enough. That's all that really matters. And you're probably not going to have to deal with quantum mechanics in your Rails app, probably. So let's talk about actual time. Here's a quick timeline of time, if you will. About 4000 BC, we started having astronomical clocks, started figuring out a little bit of an idea of like what things are going to happen during the day. 1500 BC, we had sundialed subdivisions for the first few times. Before this, we kind of just had like day and night. We'd go outside and be like, oh, it's night and day and stuff like that. Get a little bit more accurate. 14th century, we started having fixed length hours. Before that, like seasons kind of changed the hours depending on growing seasons and stuff like that. Most of what I'm going to talk about today is we can blame farmers because they have to do weird stuff with time. 16th century, we started having minutes because we didn't really care about minutes beforehand, and now we had to like do jobs and do things and stuff like that. 17th century, seconds. Around like the 1800s or so, in 1883 at least, the USA started standardizing time itself. This is pretty much in parallel with railroads. Railroads were suddenly like, oh, now we have to worry about like coordinating different things. So a bunch of like old railroad people went to Chicago and like went to a ritzy hotel and said, we're gonna standardize time. And then they got like the telegraph, and then they standardized time across the United States. It's pretty similar for a lot of other countries around this time too. We started figuring out and defining what time is. 1967 was like the really big part of it. This is when we started going towards an atomic standard of time. If you're wondering what a second is, it's 9,192,631,770 energy transitions of the cesium atom. So if you have a bunch of those in your backyard, you can, define time for yourself if you really want to. This is pretty accurate. This is roughly the accuracy to about 1 second lost in every 1.4 million years, which kind of equates to losing like 2 nanoseconds a month, which I blame on why I'm late to all your meetings. We're getting better at this though, because now we're starting to do like these optical clocks, which like kind of tick like 100 times faster than these atomic clocks. So if you could somehow make this cool optical clock that they're working on now, and you started at the Big Bang 14 billion years ago, and you ran it until now, it would have lost about 100 seconds. None of this stuff matters in your Rails apps again, but I just find it fascinating. And then this brings us to today, where you fuck up a time zone bug and you get really mad, and you're like, why? So, all of what I just said revolves around one simple question. What time is it? And we say like, oh, what time is it? How long is this guy going to go on for and stuff like that? But the implicit question here is something else. It's, what time is it here? For a long time, we would be like, oh, what time is it here? Because we can't move that far. I could run really fast, but time is probably going to be constant for however far I can make in a day. Once we started getting planes, trains, and automobiles, the question started going towards, well, what time is it over there? Does it really matter? Travel time, trying to coordinate time at long distances. This question became more important. And this question ruined everything. Without this question, time would be a lot easier. We could all just have like one thing and we wouldn't have to care. Found this on Wikipedia, I loved it. It's like a universal dial plate. You don't have to worry about the specifics, but like it's just, they used to have these really big plates and illustrations and stuff of all the different times in every different city. Because different cities would be 3 minutes off, 12 minutes off, a couple hours off, just because, New Orleans wanted to be weird that year or something like that. So this is really confusing. So at least it's better than what we had before. When you start saying, okay, how do we fix this? How do we make this a little bit better and easier to deal with? You start saying, well, we could do time zones, right? And you start figuring, well, we got like 24 hours in a day, like we expect 24 hours, or 24 time zones that we should have, right? That'd be logical, and obviously nothing in this talk is logical. We have 39 time zones. And the reason for this is that time zones get added gradually and haphazardly, and they change all of the course of human history and stuff. Today, if you noticed it, Florida, crazy Florida people decided to just go to daylight savings time. So they're not going to switch anymore. They're just going to stay on one thing, which is awesome, but then that means we have to worry about just Florida doing that and then change all this other stuff. But I forget where I was talking about here, but time zones are really weird. They don't really make a lot of sense, but that's just the system that we've kind of come up with over the time. And it's also important to note, time zones are not just plus or minus 1 hour. You can have 30-minute time zone shifts, 45-minute time zone shifts. A lot of this stuff gets really weird. That's kind of the theme of everything. Like, we're trying to build, we're trying to take like a very political system and putting it on this really irregular idea of like vibrations of a cesium atom or something like that. Like, this is a very strange system. And that brings us to like why time is really hard. Because like the first thing, you can't really just go off willy-nilly and install gems and try and fix this stuff without trying to figure out why are we trying to go to such great lengths to try and combat all these problems. Good news though, it's not just you. Humans have been pretty uniquely shit at dealing with time for eons. Like, for a long, long time, humans just had a hard time coordinating things and dealing with time zones, and some people want to do this thing, and it's really tricky. It's kind of like you have like this beautiful house in mind, and you're like, I'm going to build this cool house, and I'm going to put it on this terrible foundation. Everything's going to be terrible and garbage and crap. That's time, basically. Problems are naturally going to stem from this. Quick sidebar. Close your eyes, and then tell me 5 things you did on December 30th, 2011. See, nobody can do it. There's only one explanation for this, is that you're all Samoan. A little bit more context. Samoan people did not have December 30th, 2011. They skipped from the 29th straight to the 31st. A little bit more context. Samoa, right around this general vicinity, was like, they were looking around, they're like, wow, this is weird. Like, most of our trading partners are all y'all, like Australia, New Zealand, Japan. This had changed over subsequent decades. So they'd be doing stuff, trying to make those deals on Friday and be like, yo, buy my stuff, and then all you guys would be like, I don't know, fucking off in a park drinking coffee or something, and be like, yeah, I'm not gonna work right now. So then after a while, they're like, this is really dumb, we're just gonna shift over to the other part of the date line and start, getting back with the people that we actually do business with. Smart idea in theory. The other aspect that is important to realize is that American Samoa is about 100 kilometers away from Samoa. Now, just to simplify this all for you, you got Samoa time zone, which is Samoa and American Samoa, which are 2 different countries, which is not true because one's a country and one's an unincorporated territory of the United States, which is also complicated. Samoa's like, nah, we're not going to deal with this time zone anymore. We're going to go to Western Samoa, or West Samoa time zone. We're going to do 2 separate things. Now, Samoa time zone was UTC minus 11. West Samoa is UTC plus 12. So that means that they're only 100 kilometers away or so, but they're 24 hours away from American Samoa, even though they're kind of neighbors and stuff like this. Which is also not the case because they're 25 hours ahead of American Samoa, because even though American Samoa doesn't observe daylight savings time, West Samoa also doesn't observe daylight savings time until they did, because they said in 2009, we're going to start moving to daylight savings time. Which is also not true because there's an earthquake and a tsunami, so they said, we're going to push this back a year, and we're going to do daylight savings time in 2010. Now, for the astute one of you in the audience, you realize you've heard this story before, because they did this before in July 4th, 1892. They said, hey, we're going to do this date twice, and we're going to go towards America, because that was our trading partner back in the day, so they did the opposite. You've also noticed that this is Independence Day in America, so they got to fire off fireworks 2 days in a row, which is really patriotic, which is fantastic. This is also similar to Tokelau, which is territory of New Zealand. They said, hey, this is a really smart idea. We're going to also move to West Samoa time, and they did this in December 30th, 2011. So that was just a little quick simplification of like what was going on here. There's a really good interview after all of this, and the interview is, you can hear the sound of a lot of vehicles going around town, going around the center town clock and tooting their horns, people screaming. We have once again achieved another milestone in the history of Samoa. Now, I don't know who said that, but clearly whoever said that doesn't have to fucking deal with all the edge cases arising from this. This is just one tiny part of just the system that we have to deal with. Time is really hard. It's a difficult problem. One other quick example. 1918, Russia switches from the Gregorian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. 1908, Russia was on the Julian calendar. England was on the Gregorian calendar. This is important. In the 1908 Olympics in London, or they took place in London, they said, okay, yeah, the Russian shooting team, you should show up to the Olympics on this certain day for your particular event. You can probably figure out where this is going. So the number of days late that the Russian Olympic shooting team arrived in London was 12. They showed up, medals have been handed out or something, and they're like, well, that was a bummer, let's go home. You would have thought that they would have learned from this already, because in 1805, the Russians were 12 days late as well, trying to reinforce their Austrian allies against Napoleon. Napoleon actually ended up running through Austria, and they were like, what the heck, Russians? Like, you're our allies. And they're like, well, we came on the day you told us, but the calendars didn't match up, and it was really terrible. So yeah, Napoleon won, as usual. Time is really hard. I have just a ridiculous amount of other examples that I could talk about, but I just didn't have the time. By the end of this talk, I just want the last 5 minutes to just be groans. Just, So let's get to the main event, code. We got to deal with all these sorts of times, and how do we figure out the best way to do this with our Ruby or JavaScript or whatever the case is? This is where the real fun starts. When I was writing this talk, I was really kind of listening to one of my kind of favorite modern day philosophers or whatever, which is Nasty Nas. And he was saying, he's got this song where he says, you got CD-ROM, everything operated by computers, then what happens when circuit breaks? Y2K is the big scare. Scientists say we ain't prepared. I don't really know what this means, but if Nas is worried about this, I think we should be really concerned too. So how do we tackle all this sort of stuff? First thing, the very basic thing, and why everyone sort of says use UTC, you have to worry about storing time in your systems. Because at some point you're gonna have to stash the time, and then you're gonna have to display the time later, right? So the first thing to realize here, use UTC. It's a good piece of advice. Store everything in UTC, don't have your server be on Pacific time, and then your other server on this other time. That gets really confusing. Now for those who really don't know what UTC is, UTC stands for Universal Coordinated Time. This deserves some explanation. Now in English, they wanted to call it Coordinated Universal Time. It's a nice phrase. In French, they wanted to call it Temps Universal Cordon or something. I don't really speak French, but something like that. So they had these two different acronyms, like cut and tuck, and that would be weird to have two different things. So they compromised on UTC. Which, if your time standard doesn't correctly map to an acronym, that doesn't bode well for the standard itself. Or it's an amazing metaphor for dealing with time. I want to go with the latter, I think. But UTC is interesting. UTC was built as a time standard, as a zero offset, meaning there's no shift because it is the standard that you offset from. UTC is not GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. This is sort of gets confused from time to time. They're very similar in that GMT is UTC plus 0 as well, so not shifted, but GMT is a time zone, UTC is a standard, and the main problem is that GMT, some users use daylight savings time in GMT, so it's not something that you want to set on your servers or something like that. Use UTC everywhere. The first thing that you really kind of ask yourself before you get really deep into this is, do you even need to store time? Which I thought was kind of an interesting question because we're talking about time so much. But programmers really want to store the most high fidelity data of all time. So if I have 2 data points and I'm saying, save this in your database, a couple weeks from now, sometime, or down to the nanosecond of perfectly accurate something rather. Every programmer is going to be I need that accuracy because my stupid blogging app is really important to have that accuracy. But there's a lot of cases where you don't necessarily have to have that accuracy. Birthdays are the best example. It's kind of like a floating time where you just say, oh yeah, my birthday is June 24th, and I don't care about what date shift and time shift that I have to deal with and stuff. It's just if the day is the day, then it's my birthday, And it simplifies a lot of things if you just sometimes use a date column in your database instead of doing a time column. Then you don't have to deal with time zones, you don't have to deal with shifting stuff, you don't have to deal with any of that stuff. You can save a ton of headaches, and it just makes it a lot better. That's not always the case, though. A lot of the times, you're going to have to start dealing with time. And for some precision, this stuff doesn't matter as much. If you're doing a post-created ad or something, it's probably not that big of a deal. But there are other use cases where you have to really worry about specific, what time did this actually take place? So if you look at a kind of a normal, hey, we're having an events table, and we'll have a starts at column. We're going to make that a timestamp in our database. One thing that you might want to start thinking about is adding a separate field just to keep the time zone data as well as the actual timestamp. This is a string which is kind of interesting. And this is mostly goes back to the idea that you have to have better, you're a programmer, you have to have the most high fidelity data you can possibly get. And if you just store the offset, and you're just saying, oh yeah, this is just the offset, maybe this isn't the timestamp above, and I think that's fine. It doesn't give you like the best information possible because you can't go back in time and figure out, oh, was this daylight savings time? Was it not daylight savings time? What was the actual case here? So the best suggested way of doing this is using the full IANA qualifier for the time zone, and then saving that in the database alongside your actual timestamp itself. And then use UTC. The next part is like, cool, I have this stuff in my database or flat file or post-it note or whatever. Like, how do I transit this to my user? You know, they gotta actually use this stuff, right? Biggest thing here is just be consistent as possible in all of your API calls. Either like if you have a public API, but also if you're just, you know, your JavaScript apps calling something from the server or whatever the case is. And that's kind of it, like just be consistent. There's one answer here. Like to be consistent, use ISO 8601. That's the standard, that's what everyone uses. It stemmed from like 1988 where a bunch of smarter people were like, hey, we're gonna make a cool standard, and this is it, so use it. In Ruby, as everyone knows, you know, you type out time.now.iso 8601, and of course you get a no method error, because you have like one time class in core Ruby and another in the Ruby standard library, and I still don't really understand why this is a thing. Somebody tell me if you're responsible for this. So neat. So basically, yeah, you require time first, and then you call this, and then you get, this is a nice ISO 8601 timestamp. There's a number of reasons why we do this as a community, why this is a good thing. For one, you get a very easy way to sort. Like anybody who's like a fourth-day developer can probably figure out a way to sort this sort of stuff, because it's year, month, day, and then she's going more and more specific. So it's very easy to sort this stuff at a glance. Humans can even sort it, kind of nice. You get time zones, some understanding of an offset. Doesn't give you the full fidelity that you would probably want from stuff, but at least gives you a little bit more details on all this sort of stuff. There's no locale problems between is this the 1st of February or January. I have a hard time even saying this. Like it gets confusing, so there's no ambiguity there. Moral of the story, just use this over any wire you're sending to your API or your clients or customers or whatever the case is. Really quick sidebar, RFC 3339 is very similar to this sort of stuff, and you may see this in conjunction or as an alternative to the ISO format. It's basically like a subset of ISO 8601. It's quite a bit newer. It's very making this kind of a generic assertion, but like timestamps are basically required here versus in the other one, you can have just date stamps and stuff like that. A little bit more strict. But basically it's the same thing, for lack of a better word. Most APIs that you're going to see will end up using ISO 8601 and call it a day and everything is fine. Along these lines, in Rails land, if you look at like active support, time zone, just nice set of classes and methods and stuff that will help you out with a lot of these sorts of things. If you type out time.zone, Rails will return like a nice, oh, that's Pacific time, US and Canada. Which is kind of nice. You can like float this up to your user and stuff like this, but this isn't something that you should really do. It's really convenient in Rails, but it's a very non-standard thing. So if you're ever going to have your software talk with any other software, any other clients or something, you shouldn't persist this really, because it's just like somebody else in JavaScript or something is going to have to write something to parse this out, and it gets confusing. So instead, off of time.zone, you want tzinfo. That gives you a nice object with a lot more data. And then from there, canonical identifier is going to be the exact string that you're going to want to save in your database or save in a session or whatever the case is. This is a reference to the IANA Olsen database. If you've heard that before. If you have any questions about like, what time zone was this? There was like the Netherlands was 14 minutes off of a time zone like 100 years ago or something. I think it's in the Olsen database and stuff. Like it's the book and every language uses it. Also in Ruby, tzinfo, gem install that, and it will just fix all your problems, sort of. Next sort of thing is like, cool, it's now getting closer to the user. Like, how do we deal with this sort of stuff next? Formatting time is kind of like the next big question. I saw this tweet last year, and it's hilarious. British Press Corps is locked outside the White House because our birth dates were submitted in UK format, and Secret Service don't get it. This is totally true. Like, they held them up for like a couple hours, and they're like, trying to sneak in here or something? It's like, no, this is how we Brits say stuff. Which is true. Like, if you look at a nice ISO 8601 date stamp, you're like, oh yeah, there's zero ambiguity there, makes a lot of sense. The Brits may write it this way, the Americans may write it this way, and the French, I don't know what they do. I don't speak French, so like I don't know. But people have their own sort of ways of formatting dates and stuff like that. So like one way you can do this is use preferences wherever it's possible. There's a lot of ways you can sort of sniff this out and figure out like, oh, you're in this locale, so this may be right. But then there's a bunch of like expats who may have moved and they want things different ways. So the best way is sort of allow people to sort of write their own date formatting or select their own date formatting, and that would be fine enough. In JavaScript world, you can use INTL, International. It has a bunch of date time formatting specific stuff. And lets you deal with like the browser locale and does a lot of this stuff for you, so you don't have to install a bunch of stuff on top of that. Also in JavaScript, just use time libraries as much as possible. Like you don't want to be writing this yourself because it's terrible. Moment.js is kind of the gold standard. It's the easiest way to just manipulate dates and figure out like, oh, when does this happen? What happens if I add 2 hours to this? Is it the same month? Stuff like that. Date functions is kind of the new kid on the block that a lot of people like. Time elements is a small web component from GitHub, which is kind of interesting because it helps do that sort of locale formatting for you automatically, which is really nice. But like the whole thing is just like, it doesn't matter really what you pick. Stand on other people's shoulders because there's a lot of really detailed stuff that you won't have to go through yourself. And on top of that, like, don't be afraid to abstract those time abstractions too. Because there are so many different libraries, it makes it a lot easier to jump between different libraries if you have a nice abstraction, and you can put different hooks into this sort of stuff too. So if you have a nice abstraction over like moment.js, you can say, oh, I'm going to go through our helper classes, and then I'm going to start a timer, so on our page it'll just update every 60 seconds to keep like the time current and stuff like that. So don't get too locked into a particular library. I'm saying this because I've been locked into a library, and I'm like, oh, God, I should have switched to something earlier. Or if only I had this cool, not terrible speaker telling me to abstract these time abstractions, could have saved so much time. That one wasn't even on purpose. Other thing about this is sort of like generally like accessible concerns. If you look on like a normal website, you'll see like normal social website, you'll see like a comment like this or something, or a post or something like that. And on the bottom, very frequently you'll see like a relative time or date stamp. 2 minutes ago this happened. Cool. This is kind of all over the place. It's very normal at this point, but there's a lot of problems with like how this is sort of set up at this point. For one, like it may not update the timestamp. So if I open your site and then go off to lunch, 1 minute ago that it's not up to date and stuff like that, like it's somewhat trivial to like add a counter and then update this so this is like an actual real-time feel and figure out like, oh, this is the actual time ago. It also has problems if like, about a year ago, what is that, like 7 months ago, or like 2 months ago, 14 months ago, like it's kind of confusing. There's not a lot of great fidelity of like, well, when is this? One of the things that GitHub has done for like a decade, which I really, really liked, pretty much anytime there's relative times on the page, you can always mouse it over. And they use the title attribute to put like a little bit more human actual timestamp, so you can read and be like, oh yeah, about a year ago was this specific date, which can be really helpful if you're trying to bisect something really confusing or whatever the case is. So if you're trying to do this on your own site, the time element is really what you want to be doing here. This is kind of like the normal best practice, I guess, at this point. So for one, you can still output to the page like normal. Yeah, this happened 6 minutes ago and stuff. Browsers that don't understand the time element anymore, which I don't think are any of them at this point, will just print this out as normal. You can put your title on here as well, so you can get that nice little mouse over effect, and then the humans can actually see what's going on. It also has the date time attribute, so machines can figure out a better understanding of when specifically this is. If anybody have a guess what time format this is? ISO 8601. It's everywhere. But that's like a helpful way to support machines reading your stuff. And really, like, this is more of the ideal way you should print any sort of time, or at least any sort of relative time, to your web page at this day and age. Next little bits is inputting time. How do you take the time from the customers and give it to the developers? I was trying to quote Office Space there. It really didn't work out. if anybody's ever dug into this, it's truly terrible. These are like, date time pickers and calendars, and like it's really uniquely garbage on the internet. This is like the section of my slides where I'm just going to say like everything is terrible, because everything is truly terrible. A while ago, some smart browser people were like, wow, everybody's been reinventing the wheel. We should just put this in the spec. So they started doing this, and like, oh, we already have the input spec. We could like do this a lot better for everybody. So like in Chrome, for example, here, you can do input type equals time, and then you have like an actual time selector here, which is kind of nice. They also have input type equals date, and then Chrome has a various looking calendar thing, and you can do stuff, and it's fine. And naturally in Safari, if you do any of this sort of stuff, it doesn't work. It sort of degrades gracefully, but then you don't know what format things are coming in, and it's really terrible. On top of that, like you can't really style this. There's a couple hooks into styling input dates and input times, but you're really limited in your ability to actually make this not look like garbage. I was talking to some people recently, and I was like, well, when will input date or time or anything of that sort of stuff be really well supported? And just laughed. I'm like, oh god, probably never. So I don't think browsers are going to help us, which is unfortunate. So basically everything is terrible. My advice with all of this sort of stuff, if you're doing any sort of web time input related things, just pick something, try to style it as best you can, and then just give up. Just because you can bounce between all these different things, and it takes a little bit of time to like set this up and wire it to your new thing, and it's just like, I have not found like a single library that is like really accessible, looks really nice, and isn't kind of terrible. So yeah, don't worry about it too much, I guess. Next little bit is, man, there's a lot to talk about just like the logic of time itself. For one, like natural language processing. This is a very complex subject, but there's a lot of things that we can kind of do. Like if you start saying, oh yeah, third Wednesday in November at 3 p.m. and stuff. As Rubyists, we get all the cool tools. Chronic has been around for a very long time. It's well tested, and it will basically parse things like this into Ruby things that you can actually do stuff with. So look at Chronic if you're ever interested in any of this sort of stuff. On recurring events, like I'm just gonna immediately say like everything is terrible. Honestly, try to avoid at all costs like recurring events in your app. It's terrible. So recurring events, when you start thinking about it, you're like, all right, this is gonna happen every Tuesday at 2 p.m. And the first thing you may do as like a developer is you say, okay, I'm gonna insert one record in my database for like every single week, and then it takes about 3 seconds before you realize, oh yeah, time goes on forever. This isn't, I'm gonna get a bigger AWS server at this point. So it's unlikely you're gonna really want to do this. One way you can get around this is by putting really hard boundaries on all of this and say, I'm just gonna pre-fill all my events for the next year, and then just kind of chill with that and then be fine. But there's a couple other ways if you have to deal with this and you can't put boundaries on things from there. For one, you can kind of do this shorthand notation. Martin Fowler wrote a really interesting white paper if you're a terrible nerd like me and really get really into time and dates. It's like 6 pages, really easy to read. He talks about this problem, especially around scheduling and stuff like that. And he kind of called them like temporal expressions. In this case, this is, I still don't know how to say this, rule? Rule? It's a recurrence rule. This is defined in RFC 5545, and this gives you a lot of power surrounding how do you define what a recurring event is in your system. So when you say stuff like every Tuesday at 2 p.m., there's a lot of questions about like, what about daily saves time? If I want every Tuesday except for March 13, so that's an exception, and March 20, but then at some point that gets moved to the 21st at 3 p.m. Like, you can see how terrible this is to deal with at some point. Rule handles this because there's a bunch of different parts in the spec that gives you power over doing all this sort of stuff, but it's just really tricky. In Ruby land, again, because we have everything, because we're the coolest people on the block, there's a gem called IceCube that kind of tackles this and like does a lot of the heavy lifting, so you can do more of the heavy lifting yourself on your own app. But in general, like this is really complicated. Like it's not a super fun area to be in, which is why I kind of say like try to use real records as much as possible. Like try to set boundaries up, even though it's kind of like a limitation and kind of inefficient to like pre-fill everything for the rest of the year. but it just reduces so much headaches as much as possible. So just to kind of wrap up, I've been working on a calendar for like a year, and I'm like, holy crap, I built sort of a calendar that works. That hasn't launched yet, so you don't know if it works or not. But I have like some thoughts for closing on all this sort of stuff. Number one, use standards as much as possible. ISO 8601, said this a few times. Use that everywhere. Use UTC everywhere, of course. But this also means time libraries and stuff. Use somebody else's work. Let somebody else do all the heavy lifting and make this stuff more accurate for you and your software users. The other thing that is kind of weirdly kind of backwards and stuff, but simple and inefficient is usually the best when you talk about time. As programmers, we want the most coolest solution and stuff like that, but sometimes it's amazing how many little tiny edge cases there are specifically around time and time zones and everything I've talked about, to where if you can just brute force it and be don't really care, I'm going to make a bunch of database records that I don't need, or I'm going to do this other way that's kind of dumb, that's probably better for you. And it's one of those things where it's just the pyramid of crap that you build up. If you don't do that, it just starts getting really, really crazy. And then the other kind of sort of backward logic with all of this stuff is handling more logic in the client, especially if you have a lot of clients, or you have an ecosystem, or a lot of people using your API or something like this. I think this is kind of backwards, because we always say oh, don't repeat yourself, and, don't repeat yourself and stuff. And we want to be very simple and stuff like this. But when it comes to time, there's so many edge cases where the easiest way to do this is just have a really dumb server that only does UTC, doesn't do a lot of time zone calculations. You just send it the boundaries, and then it just returns the records between the boundaries and stuff. And then let your client do the really complicated time zone conversions and all that sort of stuff later. I think that's the more simplified way of doing this sort of stuff. So in general, I think the most important thing out of this talk is that you just never build a calendar. I don't need more competition, but other than that, I hope you don't think that time programming is quite as scary, because it's one of those weird problems where we're not trying to develop cold fusion here. Is this even possible? Clearly this is possible, and there's a bunch of rules, and it's terrible to kind of think through these things sometimes, but it's very doable because we've defined this over time. So hopefully it's not quite as scary, and I could talk more about this, but time is up. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much, Zach. Thanks for taking the time to be here at our conference.
Oh, that was a good one.
I'm glad we weren't your second choice.
Oh dear.
And on a personal note, dealing with time really does tick me off. Thank you.
I like that.